Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. It's a real honor and privilege to be here at the Baha'i Center. I'm especially grateful to Ariel Cates, the Greenwich Village Historic Preservation Society, Pete Gardner of the Merchant House Museum, and Amita Manganani at the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU for helping make this event tonight happen. As a descendant of refugees, I've long been interested in how the movement to exclude Chinese immigrants from the United States in the late 19th century established the political traditions and legal precedents that have structured immigration policy ever since. They profoundly shaped my own family's American experience, even if they didn't know it at the time. This history is becoming more and more well known, at the same time it's becoming more and more important, and I consider myself to be a part of a broader effort documenting how anti-Asian politics and anti-immigrant politics in the late 19th century were foundational for our current moment. But when I was asked last year to give a lecture on Chinese exclusion at NYU, I decided that in the age of Trump, I did not want to or need to focus on the proponents of racist immigration restriction, but instead I wanted to focus on how Chinese Americans fought such scapegoating. In putting together that lecture, I was struck by just how many of the voices that I found were coming not just from New York, but from the village. Exploring how these Chinese Americans resisted discriminatory legislation in the late 19th century is an active field of study, and there's lots more to be done. And as I dug deeper into the New York and Greenwich Village dimensions of this, which is still in process, I began to see how a group of young immigrants from the Guangzhou province of China, who all went to college in the United States, were actively working with the Protestant churches in the village to effect political change. There were not that many Chinese Americans outside of the West Coast, and those that were there mainly couldn't vote, so they had to find other ways to assert their interests. But because the Chinese American activists I'm going to talk about tonight were connected to powerful white institutions, I've been able to find a tremendous amount of information about them, which is often not the case for people of color in this period. And I hope you'll agree at the end that they have a story worth telling. But before I tell that story, I just want to say one thing and give a note about language. I've decided to pronounce the Chinese names the way that the characters and actors in this story wrote them in English. I don't speak Chinese, and so I'm sort of limited in that way, but also I believe that's the way that they wanted people to pronounce them at that time. I've also decided to use the word Chinaman when I'm quoting. That term was only becoming the racial epithet that it is today in the 1890s, but I realize it might be jarring for some people to hear me say that word. I hope that as we go forward, you'll agree that there's no way around it, though. To begin, I want to start with a map that the incredible staff at the APA Institute at NYU helped me make for a series of walking tours I did 2 weeks ago. These are Chinese American sites in the 1880s and the 1890s, from 6th Avenue to 2nd Avenue, and from West 3rd Street to 14th Street. We don't think of the village as a Chinese American space at this time, and I would not say that it constituted a Chinese American neighborhood, but it is striking to me how many Chinese Americans and how many Chinese American institutions there were in a fairly small area. And were we to expand this map to all the way out to the rivers and down to Houston Street, which perhaps I'll someday do, it would be even more impressive. Nevertheless, let me just explain it quickly. The 30 orange squares that you see were Chinese laundries that were in operation in 1890. Most of them had been open a few years before 1890, and most of them stayed open for a few years after. And most of them would have had 2 to 5 Chinese Americans living at them at that time. The 6 red triangles represent churches that held Chinese Sunday schools, where 15 to 75 Chinese American adults, many but not all of which were laundrymen, attended free English classes every Sunday. These schools typically employed 1 to 2 Chinese Americans, and each of the churches depicted here had 1 to 2 dozen Chinese American congregants in the 1890s, who were typically former Sunday school scholars themselves who had grown interested in Christianity while studying English, which was sort of part of the plan. The pink dot, which is 26 West 9th Street, was actually the Chinese consulate from 1883 to 1902, which was housed in the first 2 floors of a brownstone building that's no longer there, where 5 Chinese diplomats and a handful of students, college students who had just arrived, lived at any given time. The blue triangles represent the Presbyterian Chinese mission, which moved around quite a bit in this neighborhood between 1885 and 1908 when it moved down to Chinatown. The mission housed a handful of Chinese Americans who were interested in Sunday school and mission work, and hosted weekly services and dinners that regularly drew 50 to 100 Chinese Americans. A similar but much shorter-lived Chinese Sunday School Union office and reading room was over there on 2nd Avenue from 1884 to 1889, represented by a green triangle. And the green star on St. Mark's Place was the Chinese Guild, which was a mutual benefit society located there from 1889 to 1897, that had 600 members, most of them laundrymen, who regularly utilized the clubhouse and attended weekly meetings. So you see, while this was not a Chinese American neighborhood in the late 19th century, Chinese Americans were certainly a presence in the village at that time. This is young Kwai. He was born in 1861 and traveled to Springfield, Massachusetts at the age of 12 to live with a local family and attend high school there as part of a government program designed to bring China and America closer together. Young and the rest of the 120 students living across New England as part of this Chinese educational mission came to the U.S. at the height of President Ulysses S. Grant's Reconstruction program. Most of them lived with Republican families who supported Grant and were also active Christians dedicated to the promise of racial equality and the role that democracy might play in transforming the nation and the world. And Young absorbed these ideals early and deeply. When he wrote his family about his budding interest in Christianity, his father, the Chinese Minister of Education, went apoplectic. And he demanded that the ministers return his son to China after he graduated high school. But by then, Young had fallen in love with America, as well as with one of his white classmates. So he ran away, cut off his cue, and joined a church, nearly provoking an international incident. Ultimately, the U.S. and Chinese authorities allowed Young to stay in the U.S. and attend Yale for college, so long as he promised to work for the Chinese government after he graduated. While at Yale, Young watched the Congress of his adopted country turn against him and other Chinese immigrants. While originally an issue championed by Democrats in the western states who were opposed to Grant's Reconstruction policies, by the end of Young's sophomore year, enough Republicans in Congress agreed that the Chinese must go. So many so that they were able to override a presidential veto and do just that. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first piece of federal legislation to limit immigration from a specific country. It barred Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. for 10 years unless they had already been here previous to the Act's passage. It also clarified that Chinese immigrants could not naturalize. The Chinese government had agreed to this policy as an economic measure, provided that the rights of the 90,000 estimated Chinese subjects already in the United States would be respected equal to those of any other national group. When the act went into effect, Young, who was then 21, wrote, "It is amusing to see the so-called Christians tremble lest the Chinese are going to revolutionize society. Christians of ancient times dared to defy mighty Rome. How their descendants have degenerated. You send missionaries to China. You need not go so far. It's worthwhile to remember that the Chinese had practiced exclusiveness themselves, but they were forced to give this up at the mouth of a cannon. They now have occasion to laugh at seeing a great republic standing at the head of the world's progress, now picking up what they cast away as useless long ago." A month before Young graduated college, in the spring of 1884, Republicans in Congress decided to expand the Exclusion Acts to include any immigrant of the Chinese race, regardless of his actual nationality, from entering the United States, even though the Chinese population had already declined 10% in the 2 years since the passage of the first Exclusion Act. This second Exclusion Act was the first law in U.S. history to target a specific immigration law in U.S. history to target a specific ethnic or racial group. And many stalwart Republicans considered it to be an affront to the principles of equal rights that they considered to be the basis of the party of Lincoln. But other Republicans embraced a different calculus. With a bitter presidential election campaign underway, many Republicans did not want to leave themselves vulnerable to Democratic criticisms that they were soft on Chinese immigration. To Young, their message was clear. Anti-Chinese politics were here to stay, and he decided that he wanted to work as an interpreter for the Chinese consulate in New York on 9th Street, so that he could participate in efforts there to assist Chinese American laborers navigate their new political and legal realities. Young Kwai moved into the Chinese consulate in June 1884, just weeks after the Senator-cum-Secretary of State James G. Blaine of Maine secured the Republican nomination to run for president the coming fall. Blaine was the most prominent Republican advocate of Chinese exclusion, and many New York Republicans considered him to be a, quote, half-breed politician willing to sell out the principles of equal equality for votes, power, and money, and whose past actions were indelibly marked in the minds of many New Yorkers, as this Puck cartoon suggests. Puck's editor, Joseph Kepler, like Harper's Weekly editor, George W. Curtis, in alliance with New York Senator and former Secretary of State himself, William Evarts, and his predecessor in both roles during Grant's administration, Hamilton Fish, as well as many Protestant ministers like Henry Ward Beecher, all opposed Blaine's candidacy, and they threatened to back his Democratic rival, Grover Cleveland, then governor of New York, instead. This division, which included but was not limited to the issue of Chinese exclusion, as you can see as the zooming in on one of the tattoos, brought this powerful group of what they called mugwump Republicans into a new alliance with New York's new Chinese consul, whose name was Ouyang Ming, who was then at the time trying to figure out what to do in the wake of the Exclusion Act. The consul's younger brother had attended Yale with young Kwai on the same government scholarship, and he had also converted to Christianity, and convinced his older brother to work, and Kwai, to work together to come up with an initiative that would not only help the growing number of Chinese Americans migrating from the western states, but would also send a powerful symbol to political and religious leaders locally. The resulting project was called the Chinese Sunday School Union, which was formed in May 1884, just as the nominating conventions were underway. And it was located in the village, as I said before, on 2nd Avenue, just below 7th Street, which was in some ways the epicenter of the American missionary movement. The headquarters of the Presbyterian Board of Home and Foreign Missions was just over on 5th Avenue and 12th Street, and the headquarters of the Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church was on 14th Street and 7th Avenue. These institutions raised many hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to send missionaries and books around the country and the world. They had also been some of the most fiercest advocates for abolishing slavery and some of Grant's most staunchest supporters. Many ministers in the village in the 1880s, Protestant ministers in the village in the 1880s, felt that the anti-Chinese sentiment was at odds with their interpretation of Christianity, and they worried that the Chinese exclusion laws made American missionaries abroad look like hypocrites. In order to show Chinese Americans, their own congregants, and the world that they supported equal rights and a role for Christian benevolence in American politics, these ministers decided to hire Chinese Americans to help them organize Chinese Sunday schools in churches across the city that would teach English and offer assistance generally to Chinese American adults that were new to the city. These schools quite explicitly did not teach religion, but many involved in this project hoped that the Chinese American scholars who attended might stick around afterwards to learn more. At the first meeting of the Chinese Sunday School Union, Reverend Dr. F.F. Ellenwood, Secretary of the Board of Missions of the Presbyterian Church, explained that however politicians might feel toward the Chinese, the Church is resolved to show that it is representing something other than the typical hoodlum, and that the American feeling towards the Chinese was not portrayed by the brickbats of the Irish Catholics on the Pacific coast. Robert Bassett, Secretary of the new organization, continued, "These boys, though strange in garb and appearance, have traits of character and sympathies that you have, but they do not have what you have, which is recognition, except among the Christian people. They desire to be taught, but will politics teach them? No. Will the world? Only with bludgeons, sticks, and stones. So the Christian public must." The Reverend John Hall, Chancellor of NYU, actually wrote a poem that was maybe the best encapsulation of this politics. "Pray, oh pray, for the poor Chinese, perplexed by our legislation. Teach and help them as we ought, those who stand for a Christian nation." In the summer of 1884, as the presidential contest heated up, Samsung Bo came to New York. He was the same age as young Kwai, and had also come to the U.S. where he was raised by his uncle in Portland. But as anti-Chinese politics and violence intensified in the West, Song traveled to Michigan for high school and then went to the University of Chicago for college. After graduation, the Chinese Sunday School Union hired Song to help them open and run the reading room on 2nd Avenue. And Song offered Chinese immigrants free English classes and legal advice. Thousands of Chinese Americans were coming to New York each year, seeking refuge as the political situation in the western states got worse and worse. And Song helped them find apartments and negotiate their increasingly confusing legal status. After a year of this work, when volunteers raising money to build a pedestal for the Statue of Liberty asked Song to translate one of their appeals into Chinese, he decided to write the editor of the New York Sun. "I consider it an insult to us Chinese to call on us to contribute towards building in this land a pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, holding a torch which lights the passage of all those nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? As for the Chinese who are here, are they allowed to enjoy liberty as men and of other nationalities enjoy it? Are they allowed to go about everywhere free from the insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which other nationalities are free? Whether the statute against the Chinese or the statue to liberty will be the more lasting monument to this country will be known only to future generations. Liberty we Chinese do adore thee, but let not those who deny thee to us make of thee a graven image and invite us to bow down to it." Samsung Bo, New York City, June 28, 1885. Shortly after Samsung Bo wrote that letter to the New York Sun, Presbyterian ministers hired a 30-year-old Chinese-American seminary student named Hui Qin to open up a Chinese mission on University Place just below 9th Street, which was of course around the corner from the Chinese consulate and the Presbyterian Board of Missions, both of which helped finance it. Qin had moved to Oakland, California at the age of 14 to work. But while working there, he became interested in Christianity and ultimately decided he wanted to become a minister himself. Like many Chinese-American activists, Qin helped convince the backers of the mission project that Chinese New Yorkers needed a place to gather in peace away from prying eyes, and argued that they should rent him a space in a separate building to do his work. Qin explained that while he took the religious dimensions of his work seriously, like Samsung Bo, he mainly sought to travel the neighborhood, encouraging local laundrymen to come and learn English, and offering to help them in any ways that he could. And Qin quickly made the weekly dinners and monthly entertainments at the mission on University Place a hub of Chinese New York life. The Chinese mission and Sunday schools in New York opened just in time to receive a large influx of new residents desperate for help settling in a new city. This was because in the fall of 1885, the Western states descended into an orgy of racist violence equivalent to the anti-Jewish pogroms that were sweeping the Russian Empire at the same time. Western anti-Chinese organizers were frustrated with President Cleveland's narrow victory, since in part to attract the Eastern Mugwump vote, he had never made his position on Chinese immigration clear. Then, just after the election, Chu Hong, a Chinese-American denied re-entry into the U.S. under the Expanded Exclusion Act, secured his 14th Amendment due process rights to prove his eligibility to re-enter the country in court, even though he didn't have the proper papers. After months of simmering conflicts, on September 2nd, 1885, hundreds of white miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, attacked their Chinese neighbors and co-workers, leaving 28 dead and Chinatown burnt to the ground. Then came Seattle, where white labor groups forced hundreds of Chinese Americans onto the docks to drive them from the city until federal troops intervened. After which white leaders of hundreds of towns across the West resolved to drive their Chinese neighbors out by violence if necessary. In the face of such violence, Hui Qin and his new roommate, Guy Main, the 20-year-old son of an Anglican minister in Hong Kong who had recently moved to New York from Portland, Oregon, began touring local churches to urge their members to protest such abuses. At the University Place Church, Guy Main stated, "They say we cannot civilize them. Well, not by murder and fire, as was done at Rock Springs, where under the Wyoming sky, wolves tonight are picking at the bones of many who were murdered in cold blood. This prejudice must go. The flames have been burning long enough. The Savior came to all alike, and he included the Chinese, or else he would have inserted a clause excluding them. Such rhetoric was effective, and Young, Song, Kin, and Main helped the Chinese School Union organize a rally at Steinway Hall on 14th Street and 4th Avenue on April 5, 1886, to protest the outrages committed against Chinese Americans in the western states before an audience of 2,000, 1/10 of which were Chinese Americans themselves. There they launched a petition campaign to Congress demanding that something be done, and hundreds of churches in New York State ultimately signed this petition, which stated, "It is alleged that whole communities of Chinese have been forcibly expelled from their homes and places of business and obliged to look elsewhere for shelter and support. It is alleged that in some cases the outrages perpetrated upon the Chinese have been planned in public and that no adequate efforts, if any, have been made by officers charged with the administration of the law for their protection. These are grave allegations, and they reflect upon our character as a Christian people. Your memorialists therefore ask that measures may be devised to put an end to such wrongful courses, and that the Chinese may be protected in all respects as our own people." And this is the petition. Such political pressure did little to stem the violence sweeping the West, but it did raise money and support for Chinese Americans locally. Cleveland also knew very well that many of the signatories to these petitions had helped send him to the White House, and this likely contributed to his decision to ultimately issue the Chinese government a $277,000 indemnity for letting the rights of Chinese Americans be so flagrantly violated. This is Hong Yong Chan. He came to the U.S. at the age of 12 to attend Phillips Academy and then Yale on a Chinese government scholarship. Once it looked like the Exclusion Act was actually going to pass at the end of his sophomore year of college in 1881, Chang was recalled back to China, so he never actually graduated. But concerned about the plight of his countrymen left in America, Chang convinced his brother to fund his return in 1883 so he could help them defend their rights. The many powerful friends he had made at Phillips and Yale helped him get into Columbia Law School despite not having an undergraduate degree, and also helped him get a part-time job at a fancy downtown law firm. He regularly attended events at the Chinese Mission on University Place, and when he graduated Columbia in 1886, he moved into the Chinese consulate at 26 West 9th Street. While living at the consulate, Chang couldn't sit for the bar exam because he wasn't a citizen, and therefore couldn't be admitted even if he passed. So he used his connections to arrange a meeting with the governor, David Hill, to plead his case in person. Chang explained how important it was for Chinese New Yorkers to have a lawyer who spoke their language and who they could trust. This convinced Hill, who called on his allies in the state assembly, to enact special legislation overriding the citizenship requirement for Chang alone. But when Michael Cardozo of the Bar Association approved Chang's application, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, John Van Brunt, refused it anyways. After his denial, Chang told a reporter on 9th Street, "I propose to live here. Whether the court determines to admit me into practice or not will make no difference as to my purpose in making my home in this country." In the end, Chang got Judge George Van Hosen, a Civil War veteran himself, who sat on the Court of Common Pleas, to naturalize him under New York state law, even though federal law prohibited it. That forced Van Brunt to admit Chang to the bar, but he made him take the test again first. Chang is thought to be the first Chinese-American lawyer, and he began representing Chinese New Yorkers in court as soon as he was allowed to. In 1890, Chang decided to go to San Francisco to try to use his New York credentials to force open the California bar to Chinese immigrants, but he lost. 125 years later, in 2015, Asian American lawyers pressured the California Supreme Court to symbolically reverse this decision. While Cleveland hadn't said much about the Chinese when he ran against Blaine in 1884, the president didn't want to take any chances in 1888, especially after he knew that his mugwump supporters were going to back his Republican rival, Senator Benjamin Harrison of Indiana, who had long opposed Chinese exclusion. At first, Cleveland tried to negotiate a new treaty with China that would allow the U.S. to deny Chinese Americans re-entry into the country, but the Chinese government refused, rightly fearing that their own people would revolt. Embarrassed, Cleveland asked his friend and ally in the White House, and his ally in the House of Representatives, William Scott of Ely, Pennsylvania, who was also facing a tough re-election, to help. Scott proposed simply disregarding the existing treaty between the United States and China and requiring that only those Chinese Americans who obtained new return certificates be allowed to re-enter the U.S., even if they could otherwise prove that they had resided here before the Exclusion Acts went into effect. This was a mean bill, designed to solve a problem that didn't exist by denying a few thousand Chinese American access to the courts under the guise of preventing fraud. Cleveland signed the Scott Act on October 1st, 1888, less than 5 weeks before the election, and it went into effect on the same day. This cover of Judge, which was published on 5th Avenue and 12th Street, from the eve of the 1888 election, mocked Cleveland for making Chinese exclusion so central to his campaign. And to everyone's surprise, for once, such politics didn't work. Scott lost his re-election bid in Pennsylvania to a stalwart Republican who opposed Chinese exclusion. And even more shockingly, Harrison carried Cleveland's home state of New York by a mere 15,000 votes, barely 1%, and with it took the Electoral College and entered the White House. It would be hard, if not impossible, to know the impact of the Chinese American church organizing on the 1888 elections in New York. But with such narrow margins and the reach of the 1886 Chinese Sunday School petition campaign fresh in lots of people's minds, it was likely not an insignificant factor. Hui Qin was so excited about Harrison's surprise victory that he decided to take his honeymoon in Washington, D.C. Qin had met Louise Van Arnhem, a white woman interested in teaching Chinese Americans about Christianity at the Chinese Mission in February 1887. And Qin proposed to Van Arnhem just after Harrison's victory. Louise's father was skeptical at first. He thought his daughter was beautiful enough to marry anyone she pleased and didn't understand why she would want to pick a Chinaman. Louise responded that she realized the difference in our racial and cultural backgrounds, but believed that God created all races of one blood and meant for them to live and work together in mutual service. Who could argue with that? The two were married on University Place Church on April 4th, 1889, and had their reception at the Chinese Mission down the street. A week later, President Harrison received the new couple for tea and even gave them a bouquet from the White House Conservatory. But the Qin's honeymoon with Harrison was short-lived. Just 2 months into the new administration, the Supreme Court ruled that Che Chien-ping, a Chinese-American man who was on the ship at sea when the Scott Act went into effect, and therefore unable to acquire the proper paperwork necessary to re-enter the country, was entitled to no legal recourse. This decision clarified that Congress, not the President, had total authority over immigration because Congress, at least in theory, is supposed to control the power to wage war. Justice Stephen Fields wrote in the majority opinion that if the government of the United States, through its legislative department, considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country who will not assimilate with us to be dangerous to its peace and security, their exclusion is not to be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nation of which the foreigners are subject. This ruling completely transformed U.S. immigration law and continues to shape policy to this day. It's what prevented Obama from granting the Dreamers more solid protections without Congress, and it's also what has prevented Trump from implementing most of his immigration orders. Nevertheless, in 1889, it tied Harrison's hands. Yan Fo Li was working at the Chinese Mission when the Supreme Court ruled against Che Chien-ping. He was born in 1861 and had come with Young Kwai and Hong Ying Chang to study on a Chinese government scholarship. Li had also married a white woman he had met in college after he graduated. As the birth of their first child approached, Li decided to try to naturalize, as many of his Chinese American friends had done, since the law had room for interpretation if you knew who to ask. That is, it did until the Scott Act. Like most legal observers, Li was sure that the Supreme Court would strike down the Scott Act's blatantly discriminatory function, but he was wrong. Shortly after the Che Chien decision, which coincided with the birth of Li's second child, he wrote a scathing criticism of Chinese exclusion policy for the North American Review, entitled "The Chinese Must Stay," where he said, "The founders of the American Republic asserted the principle that all men are created equal, and made this land a refuge for the whole world. But now, looking at the actions of this generation of Americans and their treatment of other races, who can get rid of the idea that the nation, which Abraham Lincoln said was conceived in liberty, was really dedicated to the proposition that all men are created to prey on one another? The Che-Chiang-ping decision did not bode well for the future of Chinese America. And with Cleveland already plotting a political comeback rooted in race baiting, it was clear that the Chinese question would soon take center stage yet again. In anticipation of this, in addition to the fact that the Chinese Sunday School Union office had to close to make way for a new building, and that Hung Young Chan, the only Chinese-American lawyer in New York, had decided to move to San Francisco, Guy Main founded a new organization called the Chinese Guild, or the Society to Protect the Innocent, that rented the bottom two floors of 23 St. Mark's Place. And Guy got a seed grant from the St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church to do this. He wrote that he regretted very much that there was no other opening of business opportunities for our young men to enter upon other than laundries, since many of them are longing for mental improvement. To that end, the Guild offered members a music room with a piano, a game room with free tea, and a reading room full of Chinese and English books and newspapers. While subsidized by St. Bartholomew's, and sometimes used by a Sunday school, the Guild was strictly secular in order to appeal to a broad number of people. And Guy wrote that the Guild makes it its special duty to render assistance and advice whenever its members are in distress. He served as a staff interpreter and mediator who referred Guild members to trusted doctors, lawyers, and lenders. He also hired private investigators and security guards after bad experiences with the police. Most of the Guild's members were laundrymen who each paid $1 a year. And in 1891, Guy estimated that over 1,000 would have joined if he hadn't capped membership at $6.50. There was also a group within the Guild that called itself the Oriental Club, whose more elite members agreed to maintain American-style clothing and haircuts and met every other week to discuss how to prevent the renewal of the Exclusion Act, which was set to expire in May 1892. The Guild had opened just in time for Cleveland and his because Cleveland and his allies were convinced that anti-Chinese politics would bring them back into power. In 1890, New York Democrats claimed to have raised $1 million to launch a campaign encouraging New Yorkers to buy white. And in 1891, marchers in the Labor Day Parade unfurled a large banner in Washington Square Park with a caricatured Chinese laundryman above an inscription that read, "Here is where you get leprosy." Next, they came for the Chinese Sunday schools. Politicians often couch their arguments in gendered terms, and anti-Chinese agitators had long promoted the idea that Chinese laundrymen were drugging and raping white women as a way to symbolize how they were bad for the country. In 1892, they began claiming that Chinese laundrymen were only attending Sunday schools in order to flirt with white women, suggesting that the white Christian allies of Chinese Americans were dupes. This is a cartoon from Puck, making fun of this press sensation, but it had real-life effects. Many Chinese American men dated and married white women, and some of these relationships did begin in Chinese Sunday schools. But as political tensions and press attention mounted, these unions increasingly strained the commitment of many churches to the cause of racial brotherhood and equality. Embarrassed by bad publicity, Charles Krug, the white superintendent of the Chinese Sunday School at the Church of the Strangers on Mercer Street, decided to discourage relationships between Chinese scholars and white teachers. Outraged, Krug's assistant, Look Kwong, demanded his boss be fired. Look was the first Chinese American to join the Church of the Strangers. He managed a tea store on Houston Street and had studied English at the church for 2 years before converting to Christianity during the Rock Springs petition campaign. He explained his position to a reporter. "What right has Charles Krug to say who we marry? The Bible says we are all brethren and that we are as good as white people." When church leaders refused to fire Krug, Look resigned from his position as assistant superintendent and from the church entirely, and brought with him all 40 Chinese Sunday school scholars and even a few white volunteer teachers, which shut down the program entirely and it never reopened. With the Exclusion Act set to expire shortly before the 1892 presidential election, Congress decided it would expand it again. Cleveland tapped freshman Democratic Representative Thomas Geary of Sonoma, California, who was also facing a tough re-election, to propose requiring all Chinese Americans register with the government within 1 year or face deportation. But to register, Chinese Americans would have to provide 2 white witnesses to attest their legal presence in the country, as well as 2 photographs of themselves, one to be kept on file, and the other to be affixed to a certificate of residence that Chinese Americans would have to carry around with them at all times. Oriental Club members at the Guild leaned on their allies in the churches to let politicians they were in touch with know how much they opposed the measure. While this back-channel politics kept many Northeastern Republicans from supporting what Chinese Americans called the dog tag law, it wasn't enough, and Congress passed the Geary Act anyways on May 4, 1892. New York Republican opposition to the Geary Act was probably responsible for delaying Harrison from signing the Geary Bill into law, but he ultimately succumbed to that pressure on September 10, 1892. In the meantime, members of the Oriental Club met with their counterparts in Chinatown to develop a response. On September 19th, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Chinatown recommended that no Chinese Americans register and called on all New Yorkers to attend a mass rally opposing the new law at Cooper Union, where the formation of a new organization, the Chinese Equal Rights League, was announced. This new organization was modeled off of the Equal Rights League of the 1860s, which was an alliance of African American groups and northern churches that championed African American citizenship and voting rights during and after the Civil War. Dr. Joseph C. Toms, a 30-year-old recent graduate of Long Island College Hospital and supposedly the first licensed Chinese American doctor in New York, chaired the meeting at Cooper Union. Toms lived, worked, and ran a Sunday school in Brooklyn and was a member of the Oriental Club. In front of 1,500 attendees, about 1/3 of them Chinese American, he said, "The Geary Act is the work of political demagogues on the Pacific Coast who for the last 15 years have been trying to cry us down. I used to believe that the people of the United States were too honorable and fair-minded to be influenced by such sandlot statesmen, and that they would protect the rights that we are entitled to by treaty. But the time has passed, and we are no longer safe in the streets of America. We are the victims of both political parties, for the man who wants to be president will sign all the Chinese bills regardless of humanity and justice. That Chinamen living in peace in the community and respecting the law of the land should be compelled to be registered like dogs and subjected to severe penalties without the rights of habeas corpus is both undemocratic and un-American. We will submit to the laws of your land, but to the yoke of tyranny, never." Wang Qingfu, the famous journalist credited with first coining the term Chinese American and secretary of the Chinese Equal Rights League, spoke next. He said, "We simply ask that our fellow countrymen in the United States be allowed to live in peace and free from persecution, and that no biased legislation be enacted against them as a race. Is it a crime to be a Chinaman? Shall I be dragged from my bed at midnight because I refuse to be photographed? No, I will not be photographed against my will like a criminal. I would be hanged first." After many more speeches, the Reverend Dr. William B. Derrick, a leader in the African American Methodist Episcopal Church, closed out the evening. He said, "The same spirit that prompted the Exclusion Act has animated Congress for a century, and it is moving towards the exclusion of the Afro-American also. And the same measure may next fall upon the Italians or other foreign elements. We want to raise our voice against it. Why should the government lift its hand against the Chinese? Are they not men, our brothers? We can do no higher work than to stand up for them." Dr. Toms then asked the audience to endorse the following statement. "Whereas the Congress of the United States, by an act approved May 5, 1892, unjustly and wickedly discriminating between foreign residents from different countries, has traversed and contravened the fundamental principles of common law and the Constitution of the United States, and has ignored the assertion of the Declaration of Independence that all men are born with equal rights, and whereas The bill contains the outrageous proposition that any person who shall be arrested for its violation shall be adjudged guilty until he has affirmatively proven his innocence, and whereas the Chinese residents of the United States claim common manhood with the residents of other nationalities and believe that they should have that manhood recognized according to the principles of American freedom, now, therefore, we citizens of the United States, in a mass meeting assembled, do hereby resolve and declare that said bill is monstrous, inhuman, and unconstitutional, and we hereby pledge ourselves to support that protest against the bill that has been entered by the Chinese Equal Rights League of New York City. And the audience burst into screams and applause. The Chinese Equal Rights League was headquartered in what used to be the Bible House on Astor Place, a multi-denominational missionary headquarters that gave rooms out for free to causes that participating churches thought were important. There, Wong Chin-fu, Dr. Toms, Guy Main, and others coordinated another petition campaign in an attempt to force Congress to revoke or amend the Victories Act. Hundreds of churches and community groups across the state, black and white, native-born and immigrant, representing tens of thousands of New Yorkers, submitted petitions to the Chinese Equal Rights League offices, where volunteers then divided them by congressional districts to send to the appropriate party. Such pressure convinced Congress to reduce the number of witnesses down from 2 to 1, but that witness still needed to be white. Outraged, leaders of the Chinese Equal Rights League, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, Oriental Club, and other groups decided they would band together to challenge the constitutionality of the Victories Act in court. They raised $60,000 in donations to hire the best legal consultants they could find to design a test case, and they secured an agreement from the Cleveland administration not to enforce the registration requirements of the Victories Act until the Supreme Court had weighed in. On April 11th, 1893, one of the last days one could register, Li Zhou, a laundryman living uptown, and Guy Main walked into the federal building that used to be at the bottom of City Hall Park to try and register. Li Zhou had come to San Francisco in 1874, and therefore was in the U.S. legally, but he claimed that no white man knew said facts. So he offered Guy Main as his witness instead. Since Guy wasn't white, Li Zhou's application was denied, and he was the only Chinese American in New York to try. But this was all part of the plan. 2 weeks later, on May 6th, the Victories Act went into effect. At 10 a.m., Fang Yuting and Wang Quan, Chinese immigrant laborers who lived on Mott Street, met Li Zhou, Guy Main, Young Kwai outside of the federal building. They entered, and Fang Yuting, Wang Quan, and Li Zhou promptly turned themselves in for failing to register with the government. They were each testing a different part of the law. Fang Yuting was arrested but not deported to test whether the failure to register could actually be a crime. Wang Quan was arrested and deported to test whether failing to register could be grounds for deportation. And Li Zhou was arrested and deported to test whether Congress could require Chinese Americans to register with a white witness. Lawyers then filed habeas corpus claims stating that the three men had been unconstitutionally imprisoned. By lunchtime, they were released on $500 bail each. It took 4 days of denials and appeals for the case, named after Fang Yuting because he turned himself in first, to reach the Supreme Court in Washington. Most legal analysts assumed the court would toss out the Victories Act, since it seemed so clearly to violate the first section of the 14th Amendment, which entitles all persons, not citizens, in the United States to equal protections under the law. But these analysts were wrong. Using the Che Chan-ping case as precedent, 6 of the 9 justices ruled that congressional authority over immigration could include mandating the conditions of residence, however Congress wanted. Ironically, Justice Stephen J. Field, the author of the Che Chan-ping decision on which the decision rested, dissented from the Fang Yuting ruling because he did not believe that immigration law should supersede the right to due process and the presumption of innocence. But that's exactly what happened. The Fang Yuting decision still stands, and it's one of the main reasons why immigration courts are separate from other courts and have a different and distinct set of rules. After the Fang Yuting decision, members of the Chinese Equal Rights League leapt into action one more time. They convinced major church organizations to declare a nationwide day of fasting and prayer in protest of the Victories Act on May 28, 1893. which was Memorial Day, then a holiday celebrating the sacrifices that Union soldiers made to repair Southern secession. As if that statement wasn't clear enough, a few days before this fasting took place, Nai Look, a 70-year-old chef living on Pell Street who had actually served in the Union Navy during the Civil War and was a member of the Chinese Equal Rights League, turned himself in for failing to register. What the League's lawyers had learned during the test case was that Congress had so shoddily written the law in such a desperate way before the election that it didn't actually work. So Nai Look's deportation was stayed on a technicality. But all these symbolic victories bought was time. A 6-month extension for the Chinese Americans to register. In response, the Chinese government threatened to expel all Americans from China and cut off diplomatic relations entirely. But with the Japanese invasion looking more and more likely by the day, as the new deadline approached, Chinese government leaders decided they couldn't risk alienating the United States. But the vast majority of Chinese Americans had still refused to register, assuming that the government would help them. But by the fall of 1893, the best anyone could do was to get another 6-month extension. As the final registration deadline approached, hundreds if not thousands of Chinese New Yorkers returned to China, discussed it all around. Even Guy Main decided he just wanted to go visit his mother, who he hadn't seen in 16 years. Right before he left, he wrote about how many of the Chinese Sunday schools had already closed because of lack of interest. He said, "The year of 1893 will not be easily forgotten by the Chinese residents in the United States. It was a year of anxiety and persecution. The scholars seemed to have no desire to further advance their knowledge. I know men who hardly missed a Sunday for years, who were idling away their time in public parks and on the streets. When pressed for reasons, their simple reply is, 'I have no mind to study.'" Chinese Americans had to submit their papers to the government by April 1894 in order to register under the law before the deadline. But like many Chinese Americans, Fang Yuting himself waited until nearly the last day before he went to the federal building to pick up his bail money and submit his forms. Of course, this was only possible because he hadn't actually been deported, just arrested. Li Zhou and Wang Quang never retrieved their bail. Perhaps they figured out a way to get certificates anyways, or decided just to keep a low profile. But it's also possible that police had already arrested them for looking Chinese and not having certificates or bribe money on them before they had a chance to alert the authorities. Needing to have and carry these certificates of residence profoundly shaped how and where Chinese Americans decided to live their lives at the turn of the 20th century. This is a copy of Sun Yao Pang's Certificate of Residence. The original is at the Boats Library at NYU as part of the Yoshio Kishi Irene Yaling Sun collection, which was made possible in large part by a generous donation in the memory of Dr. Wei Yun Chen. It is believed to be the only certificate of residence from a Chinese American on the East Coast that survives in a public collection. Investigating just who Pang was is what introduced me to many of the people and stories that I've shared with you tonight. He came to San Francisco in 1877 from China at the age of 14 to join his father, and then moved to New York when his father went back to China to study design at Cooper Union. When Pang was Guy Main's assistant at the Chinese Guild on St. Mark's Place, he was known to draw children playing across the street. He also sometimes lived with Huey Kim at the Chinese Mission in University Place, which is the address he listed on his certificate. And he served as the superintendent of many different Chinese Sunday schools in New York and Brooklyn at different times. After failing to defeat the Geary Act, Pang and his fellow Oriental Club members decided to move the Chinese Guild down to Chinatown because most of their membership felt safer there. The remaining Chinese Sunday schools moved to Chinatown shortly thereafter, and then the consulate, and then the Chinese Mission, which was the last to go. In January 1902, as Congress began making preparations to make Chinese exclusion permanent, Pang wrote an article entitled "The Chinese in America" for Forum magazine. In it, he said, "The Chinaman in America as a social entity is almost entirely unknown. He is an alien, whether Christian or heathen. He is shy and self-contained, and a mystery to the great majority of Americans who have little sympathy with him. For their own protection, the Chinamen have been compelled to live entirely by themselves. There are no more clannish a people on earth than the Chinese in America. Other immigrants in this country are slowly but surely assimilated until all become Americans, but the Chinaman remains a Chinaman. The greatest barrier to the Americanization of the Chinese is the fact they cannot become citizens. But the next is the air of mystery about them. The Chinese have been pictured as a peculiar, unknown, and dangerous element. But the fact is that the Chinese are as little understood by the Americans as are the Americans by the Chinese, and the result is an unfortunate suspicion on both sides. Chinese diplomats did attempt to dissuade Congress from permanently extending the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1902, but failed to mobilize the Chinese American community or sympathetic churches like they did in the 1890s. By then, police surveillance and brutality had fairly well segregated Chinese American communities from everyone else. At the same time, the upheavals that swept China following the First Sino-Japanese War and then the Boxer Rebellion led most Oriental Club members to increasingly focus their attention towards toppling the imperial Chinese government, which they eventually helped do through new organizations like the Chinese Empire Reform Association, headquarters in Chinatown, whose newspaper Peng helped edit and illustrate. In fact, most of the Greenwich Village activists of the 1890s became leading fundraisers and thinkers behind New York's contributions to the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and the founding of the Republic of China, established on January 1st, 1912. On May 4th, 1912, just 5 months after the formation of the Republic of China, a dozen or so members of the Chinatown branch of the Women's Political Equality League waited on the corner of 10th Street and 5th Avenue for one of the youngest members of their organization to pass by, on horseback. 16-year-old Mabel Lee had joined 50 other women in Washington Square Park to lead a women's suffrage parade up 5th Avenue that day. And once it was their turn, the rest of the members of the Chinatown branch of the Women's Political Equality League joined the parade on foot, carrying a banner that read, "We come from a country where women have the vote." That was because, unlike America, the Republic of China had already established this right even before their new government was fully formed. Mabel Lee was born in 1896 and came with her parents to New York when she was 9. She would ultimately earn a bachelor's and then a PhD in economics from Columbia, and later assume leadership of her father's Baptist church in Chinatown. In fact, just this past fall, Congress named the post office on Doyer Street after Lee. But she spent her college years agitating for women's right to vote in the United States and globally. And 2 years after leading the suffrage parade on horseback, when Lee was a sophomore at Columbia at the age of 18, she published an essay explaining her position on women's suffrage. Part of it read, "The building up of Western civilization has, as it were, left every other beam loose in its construction by leaving out its women. And now there naturally has to be a time of difficult and careful readjustment before the structure can be made solid. I cannot too strongly impress upon the reader the importance of this consideration, for the feministic movement is not one for privileges to women, but one for the requirement of women to be worthy citizens and contribute their share towards prosperity and national greatness." New York women wouldn't win their right to vote until 1917, 3 years after Lee wrote that article. By then, Lee was 21 years old, the voting age at that time. But she was ineligible for naturalization under the Chinese Exclusion Act, so she couldn't register. While the activists I've explored with you tonight did not win their battles in their lifetimes, or all of their battles, they came closer and were more influential than many historians have suspected or realized, including myself until I did this project. And I find in the tenacity of their attempts to make this world a better place a lot of inspiration, and I think there's a lot we can learn from them. They recognized the power of organizations and did whatever they could to fit their agenda into a messy and mean-spirited political culture. They cultivated allies when they could, but they also knew when it was time to go it alone. I think they have also taught me that battles for human rights are all around us all the time, even in unexpected or hard-to-reach places. and that if we don't see them initially, we should go looking for them. I want to thank you very much for letting me share my research with you. Please feel free to ask me any questions now, or after, or by email. Thank you so much.